It's an annual event. Each year, while the National People's Congress is in session, China's foreign minister sits down with the media for a wide-ranging discussion of the country's foreign policy. And so it was earlier this week when Foreign Minister Wang Yi answered questions for more than 2 hours on a host of topics. Later, we'll go in depth on some of those issues with several international scholars, but we begin in Beijing with CCTV's Ming Tian. And Tian, what were some of the key issues discussed by Foreign Minister Wang?
You know, Anand, the relation with China and the world seems to be the focus. On the Korean Peninsula, Minister Wang said, well, sanctions are necessary. It is important to keep the peninsula stable. He said if the tension escalated and got out of control, it would be a disaster for every party concerned, and China will not allow this to happen. He also stressed the importance of dialogue as the solution to the issue, and the ultimate goal is to denuclearize the peninsula. On China-U.S. relations, he said the two countries would have both cooperation and disputes, and this is the normal case. The key is to turn the dispute to cooperation. A case in point is the agreement by the two countries on climate change, so it's a cybersecurity issue. He said now a dialogue has been set up, and he's confident that the two countries would be able to cooperate on the South China Sea issue as well. Other relations include China with Europe, with Southeast Asia, with Russia, Japan, and Africa. Also in the discussion is China's role in global governance, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Anand?
Tian, we're more than halfway through this year's meeting of the NPC and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. Besides the 13th five-year plan, what are some of the other issues and proposals that have been raised?
You're right, actually a number of them. The draft of the country's first charity law is discussed, for instance. You know, total donations in China in 2014 topped $15 billion. So the country needs such law to protect the rights of donors and the needy, as well as punishing fraud. Transparency is the key. Lawmakers are suggesting specific methods for charitable organizations to disclose information, such as why you need money, where the money is gone, and how much is left. The second child policy is another one. 2016 is the first year for the policy to become nationwide. Delegates are debating favorable policies such as tax credits, employee compensation, and more daycare centers. And poverty lift, a key task for the country's goal of becoming a moderately wealthy society. They say it is important to know who are poor and why they are poor so that they could design a customized package to help them with targeted measures. And I have to stop somewhere. The list goes on, however, but the discussion will continue. Anna?
Thanks, Tian. That's CCTV's Ming Tian reporting from Beijing. There's much to talk about with our distinguished panel, so let's get right to it. Ken Lieberthal is recognized as a top expert on China. He joins us from the Brookings Institution here in Washington, where he serves as a senior fellow for U.S. foreign policy, the global economy and development. With us from London is economics professor Kuyoo Jin. She's with the London School of Economics. Sowrav Gupta joins me in the studio. He's the resident senior fellow with the Institute for China-America Studies. And with us from Beijing is the director of the China National Association of International Studies, Victor Gao. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Victor, in that news conference, Minister Wang talked about breaking new ground in diplomacy and major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics. Break that down for us. What does it mean?
When we talk about major power diplomacy, it mainly refers to China-U.S. relations. And as we know very clearly, China-U.S. relations is not in the best shape or condition at present. As a matter of fact, there are many friction points, especially in the South China Sea. And when Foreign Minister Wang Yi talks about new ways of promoting new major power relations between China and the United States, I think he means that we need to have new thinking and new wisdom, and we cannot be burdened down by the aggressiveness by a certain party in this pair of relationship, which may eventually ruin the overall integrity of the relationship. And I think Wang Yi is absolutely correct in urging for greater wisdom and sanity to prevail rather than any side resorting to excessive means which may destabilize the relations between China and the United States, which may create a lot of chaos in the international relations.
Right, let me go to Ken. Ken, looking at U.S.-China relations, Minister Wang stressed the importance of, as I mentioned, building a new type of major country relations based on mutual respect and cooperation instead of confrontation. But He also pointed out that there are some in the United States who still have misgivings about China and its intentions. How would you characterize current Chinese foreign policy and the Chinese policy towards the United States? And how do you think it might change after the presidential election?
Well, I think, first of all, both the U.S. and China have a similar approach to our bilateral ties, which is that we recognize that things move forward where we can cooperate, and so we should enhance cooperation where we can. Things become much less manageable where we don't cooperate and cannot move in parallel directions. Our interests are not obviously identical, and therefore we should move forward where we can and try to find ways to prevent differences in interests and disagreements from escalating. So that Victor Gao's comments about the South China Sea, I think in the U.S. the perception is very much the same, except that in the U.S. view, it is the other side that is causing the problem. So it's a kind of mirror image, and it's one of the big problems we have in keeping things under control in the South China Sea. Let's face it, we have elements in both of our countries who think that the other country should be handled in a much tougher fashion. I think we have, President Obama just gave a very in-depth, very unusual interview that was published 2 days ago in the Atlantic magazine in the U.S., and he laid out quite clearly his approach to China and to foreign affairs more generally, and to put it simply, he thinks military pressure should be the last option. He thinks you need to be sensitive to the way others view things. He thinks the U.S.-China relationship is the most important strategic relationship for the United States going forward over the next several decades. And he is anxious to have China's rise be peaceful and successful, but concerned that if China acts in ways that upset global rules and norms, that the U.S. needs to push back with the goal of encouraging a peaceful rise and a more cooperative future. Those are all very general comments, but I think it's the spirit in which we approach this relationship.
Kuyoo, China will host the G20 summit for the first time in September. What do you think will be the focus of that summit?
I think the main focus is still going to be about ways to get China's economic growth going, methods of adjustment from an export investment-oriented economy towards more consumption. I think China is still equally worried about economic situations in Europe and the rest of the world. So I think the main focus is still going to be about economic adjustment.
Do you think this year's summit will identify new growth areas for the global economy?
I think we're going to hear the old stories over and over again. And in my opinion, China's economic problem is not so much the transition from investment to consumption as it is laid out. I think the problem is actually quite simple. To give the households their fair share of the GDP growth and wealth, it means that you need to promote the private sector. Now, the private sector has been extremely important in pushing China's growth in the last decade. They explain most of the productivity growth in China. They are contributing to most of the employment growth in China. So I think the problem is less about moving towards consumption, which would naturally happen as households get richer, but more about giving the right kind of environment, financial environment, economic environment for these private sectors to grow.
Sowrav, Ken mentioned the islands of the South China Sea. They've been in the news a lot recently. Let's listen to what Minister Wang said at that news conference. Let's watch.
The Nansha Islands, otherwise known as the Spratlys, are China's integral territory. Every Chinese has an obligation to defend them, and China has not and will not make new territorial claims. Yet China has every capability and confidence to work with ASEAN countries and maintain the overall picture of peace and development in the South China Sea.
Now, as you know, this has been a source of tension between China and the United States. How do you see China's activities in the South China Sea?
I see China's posture in the South China Sea as being a robust posture in terms of defending its core interests.
but at the same time operating within its rights. It's the issue of leveraging its power to pursue those interests, but at the same time operating within its rights. Now the issue has arisen that these rights are not perfectly defined, and because the legal framework of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea has left interpretive gaps out here. Now, so both sides, on either side, I'm talking the Southeast Asian countries, you can talk the United States, China, they all come to the matter from different angles, and then they interpret these rights differently. So we will get some degree of clarity once the tribunal rules later this summer, perhaps, as to who is infringing rights or not. But at this point of time, China has a very legitimate case to make that all its operations, including operations within the 9-dash line, which have attracted a lot of notoriety elsewhere, is within China's legal rights.
Victor, China has been accused of militarizing these islands. What do you make of that?
The South China Sea is within the Chinese sovereignty and territorial integrity. And if we look at who is really doing the militarization, it is the United States who is sending aircraft carrier groups from afar to the South China Sea and repeatedly violates the Chinese sovereignty and territorial integrity in the disguise of freedom of navigation. If the United States can single out any case or precedent of violation of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, put it on the table, let's talk about it. There has been no single case of violation of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea in recent memory. Therefore, apparently some country is using this very noble symbolism to pursue other objectives. From the Chinese perspective, it's very clear that is the United States is not happy with the peaceful rise of China and is muddling the water in the South China Sea and is urging certain countries, especially the Philippines, to confront China. And I think all these attempts eventually will not succeed. If China and the United States eventually end up in a confrontation with each other, no one will win that war. Both will be destroyed. And I think Washington needs to be waken up to that conclusion and eventually come up with better ways of engaging China. The United States is not a claimant to any territorial dispute in South China Sea. Just imagine if China sends its warships to the international water off California or Virginia, for example, and keep violating the US national interests in those bodies of water. What would the American people think about it?
Yes, go ahead, Ken.
Two things. One is China has recently sent a flotilla of ships through U.S. territorial waters off the coast of Alaska, and the U.S. made no negative comment about that. It's China's right to do it, as it is U.S. right to have innocent passage through waters near islands in the South China Sea or elsewhere. But secondly, Victor noted the South China Sea as China's, inside the 9-dash line, as China's sovereign territorial waters. Most of that is international waters by most people's definition. Is he claiming that somehow or other China, everything inside the 9-dash line should be treated as a territorial sea?
Ken, the minister was very clear. He said this is Chinese territory and that China has an obligation to defend that territory. Do you see a diplomatic way out of this?
Well, I think in reality, the Chinese side has been very unclear as to what its position is on the status of the underwater features that it has built up into above water islands, and also the area inside the South China Sea that is not within a 12-mile territorial limit of any above ground features, above water features in the South China Sea. And it is that lack of clarity that is of great concern to the United States. And it's of great concern for a simple reason. This area is very important as a transit sea for both commercial and military vessels. And if China were to somehow assert that it could restrict military and/or commercial vessels transiting the South China Sea, that would be a source of enormous concern to, I think, every country, not only in the region, but well outside the region, because it's critical to global trade and it's critical to global security.
Victor, do we need more clarity here on the status of these islands?
Let me put the facts on the table. When the U.S. naval ship sailed into the Western Sha Islands group, it actually intruded into the 12-mile territorial water of the Chinese island. That's a flagrant violation of the Chinese sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I don't think the United States will do itself a favor by denying that fact. And I think if the U.S. ships keep intruding into the 12-mile territorial water of the Chinese sovereignty and territorial integrity, they may be shot down eventually, and the United States will be faced with escalation of the tension in the South China Sea, which will be no good for anyone. If the United States believes that if it can force China by constantly intruding into the territorial sea of the Chinese islands, it is indulging in fantasy. China will respond in a very legal manner, but China will not back down, and China has the right to use all means necessary to defend its territorial integrity. And I think if the United States Navy or the U.S. Pentagon or the U.S. government do not fully come to the recognition of that possibility, then they need to probably search their own rationality to come up with another expectation as to what eventually will happen in the South China Sea. We are faced with very, very serious danger of escalation if the United States keeps pushing into the Chinese territorial water in the South China Sea.